The second the door clicked shut, Luke knew he messed up. No, 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 he jiggled the handle, but it was useless. The lock had already engaged. His keys. Sitting on the kitchen counter, along with his phone and any shred of dignity he had left. He exhaled sharply, staring at the closed door like he could will it into opening. It was past midnight, and he was standing barefoot in nothing but a pair of sweatpants and a worn-out t-shirt. Perfect. Just perfect. Running a hand through his hair, Luke glanced down the dimly lit hallway of his apartment building. His only hope was his neighbor, and that was a problem, because his neighbor was Maddie Carter. Maddie, the woman who had moved in 6 months ago and had been a thorn in his side ever since. She was stubborn, opinionated, and had a habit of slamming her door whenever he walked past. They had exchanged maybe 5 words in total, most of them snarky. The last thing he wanted was to owe her a favor, but it was either that or sleep in the hallway. With a resigned sigh, he knocked on her door. Silence. He knocked again, a little harder. A rustling noise came from inside, followed by footsteps. Then the door flew open, revealing Maddie in an oversized hoodie and shorts, her hair in a messy bun. She blinked at him, then frowned. "Seriously," she said, arms crossing. "What do you want?" Luke cleared his throat. "I, locked myself out." Her eyebrows shot up. "And this is my problem because," he exhaled, already regretting this. "Look, I just need to use your phone to call the building manager." Maddie studied him for a long moment, like she was debating whether or not to slam the door in his face. Then, with a dramatic sigh, she stepped aside. "Fine, but don't touch anything." Luke walked in, trying to ignore how cozy her apartment looked. Warm lighting, soft blankets draped over the couch, a faint scent of vanilla in the air. It was nothing like his own place, bare, undecorated, and impersonal. She handed him her phone, watching him like a hawk. "Make it quick." He dialed the emergency number for the building, pacing as it rang. After a few seconds, a voicemail picked up. "Great," he muttered. He tried again. Same result. Maddie leaned against the counter, arms still crossed. "Let me guess, no answer." "Yeah," he ran a hand down his face. "This is ridiculous." She sighed. "Guess you're stuck here until morning." Luke looked up. "What?" Maddie shrugged. "The office won't open until 8. "Unless you have a crowbar hidden somewhere, you're not getting back in tonight," he groaned. This night just kept getting worse. "I'll sleep in the hallway," she snorted. "Don't be stupid." "You can stay here," he blinked. "Seriously." "Don't make me repeat it," she said, rolling her eyes. "Just stay on the couch and don't snore." Luke hesitated. The idea of spending the night in Maddie's apartment felt surreal, but his options were limited. "Fine," he said. "I'll stay." She tossed him a pillow. "Try not to make yourself at home." Luke couldn't sleep. Not because the couch was uncomfortable, it was actually nicer than his own bed, but because Maddie was only a few feet away, curled up in a blanket on the other side of the room. He had never really paid attention to her before. She had always been just the neighbor, the woman who stole his parking spot and gave him annoyed looks in the elevator. But now, in the quiet of the night, he saw her differently. She wasn't as sharp-edged as she pretended to be. There was a softness in the way she clutched her blanket, a peacefulness in the way she breathed. He turned onto his side, exhaling slowly. This was going to be a long night. Luke woke to the scent of coffee and the soft clinking of dishes. For a moment, he forgot where he was. The couch beneath him was far too comfortable to be his own, the air smelled warm and sweet, and the faint hum of movement in the kitchen was unfamiliar. Then it hit him. Maddie, her apartment. The whole ridiculous situation from last night. He groaned and rubbed his face before pushing himself upright. Across the room, Maddie stood by the counter, pouring coffee into a mug. She was dressed in leggings and an oversized sweater, her hair loosely tied back. The morning light streaming through the window made her look softer, less guarded than usual. She glanced over, catching his eye. "You snore," she said, taking a sip from her mug. He raised a brow. "I don't snore," she smirked. "You do." Like a bear in hibernation. Luke stretched, rolling his shoulders. Guess I should be grateful you didn't kick me out halfway through the night. I considered it, she said, setting down her mug. But you looked pathetic enough that I let you stay. He chuckled, standing and running a hand through his hair. Remind me never to need your help again. Gladly. She slid a second mug across the counter toward him. Coffee, he hesitated, then picked it up. Thanks. Maddie leaned against the counter, watching him over the rim of her cup. The office opens in an hour. You can call them then. He nodded, taking a sip. It was good strong but not bitter. He hadn't expected her to offer him coffee, much less actually make it decent. You always wake up this early? He asked, glancing at the clock. She shrugged. Force of habit. Luke studied her, realizing how little he actually knew about her life. They had lived next to each other for months, yet all he had were assumptions. Maddie was fiery, sarcastic, and always seemed irritated with him. But now, in the quiet of the morning, she seemed different, less of a stranger. Do you hate me? He asked suddenly. Maddie blinked, clearly not expecting the question. What? You always act like I ruined your life just by existing, he said, leaning against the counter. Did I do something, or is that just your default setting? She rolled her eyes. You're dramatic. Deflection, he smirked. So what is it, my face? My personality, she sighed, setting down her mug. You're just annoying, Luke chuckled. That's not a real answer. Maddie crossed her arms. Fine, you're loud, you take up too much space. You always look like you own the place, even though you clearly don't. He grinned. So I exist too confidently. She narrowed her eyes. You know exactly what I mean. He did. Maddie wasn't the first person to tell him he had an overwhelming presence. But for some reason, her irritation amused him more than it should. You're not exactly easy to live next to either, he said. She raised a brow. Oh, really? You slam your door every time I walk past, he pointed out. You glare at me in the elevator like I personally offended you just by stepping inside. And let's not forget the time you stole my parking spot and pretended not to see me. Maddie smirked. That was funny. Luke shook his head, taking another sip of coffee. You're impossible, she shrugged. And yet you stayed. He couldn't argue with that. The hour passed faster than he expected. When the clock hit 8, Luke grabbed Maddie's phone and called the building office. After a few rings, someone finally answered, and within 10 minutes, a maintenance worker was on his way to unlock his door. Maddie leaned against the couch, watching him hang up. Guess your little adventure is over. Guess so. He hesitated, then glanced at her. Thanks for not letting me freeze to death in the hallway, she smirked. I like to think of it as an act of charity. Luke chuckled, shaking his head. Right, well, I owe you one, she tilted her head. I'll remember that. A knock at the door interrupted them. Maddie opened it, and the maintenance worker stepped inside, giving Luke a nod. Got a call about a locked-out tenant. That's me, Luke said. The worker gestured for him to follow. Luke turned to Maddie one last time. See you around, neighbor. She rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of something else in her expression. Amusement, curiosity. Whatever it was, it lingered as he stepped into the hallway. As he walked back into his own apartment, he realized something strange, for the first time since Maddie had moved in. He didn't mind the thought of seeing her again. Luke wasn't expecting things to change after that night, but they did. It started small. A nod when they passed in the hallway. A half smirk instead of an eye roll. Maddie didn't slam her door quite as hard anymore. And for some reason, Luke found himself slowing down when he knew she was near, waiting for a chance to catch her eye. Then, one evening, she knocked on his door. He opened it to find her standing there, arms crossed, an annoyed expression on her face. My Wi-Fi is down, she said flatly. He raised an eyebrow. And, she sighed, and I have a deadline. And I need to send an email, and your network is the only one I can pick up from my apartment, but it's locked. Luke folded his arms, enjoying this a little too much. So, let me get this straight. You need my help, Maddie exhaled sharply. Yes, he grinned. Say it one more time. She narrowed her eyes. Luke. Fine, fine, he said, stepping aside. Come in. She hesitated, like she was debating whether or not it was worth it. Then, with a resigned sigh, she walked past him. Her presence changed the feel of his apartment immediately. Maddie was a force, even when she wasn't trying to be. She sat at his kitchen table, opening her laptop, completely ignoring him. Luke leaned against the counter, watching her. "You know, you could have just used your phone's data." She shot him a look. "Do you want me to leave?" He smirked. "Not really." She rolled her eyes and focused on her screen. Luke should have left her alone, gone back to whatever he was doing before, but he didn't. Instead, he found himself watching the way her fingers moved over the keyboard, the way her lips pursed slightly in concentration. A few minutes passed in silence. Then, without looking up, she said, "You're staring." Luke didn't even bother denying it, just thinking. "Dangerous habit," he chuckled, pushing away from the counter. He walked over, leaning against the table next to her. "What do you do anyway?" Maddie sighed, closing her laptop. "I'm a copywriter." Luke raised a brow. "Like advertising, more or less." She stretched her arms above her head and Luke had to force himself not to stare. "Mostly freelance work, it pays the bills." "Huh," he tilted his head. "I always thought you were some kind of secret agent," she snorted. "Yeah, because secret agents definitely live in cheap apartment buildings and steal their neighbors' Wi-Fi." He grinned. "Could be a cover." Maddie rolled her eyes but didn't argue. She glanced around, taking in his apartment for the first time. "Your place is boring," Luke laughed. "Excuse me," she gestured vaguely. "No decorations, no personality. It's like a hotel room, a really sad, empty hotel room." He smirked. "I didn't realize I invited an interior design critic over." She shrugged. "Just an observation." Luke glanced around. She wasn't wrong. His apartment was bare functional, but not exactly homey. He never really cared before, but now, with Maddie sitting there, her presence filling the space, it suddenly felt a little too empty. She stood, closing her laptop. "Well, thanks for the Wi-Fi. I'll let you get back to your thrilling night of sitting alone in an empty box." Luke chuckled. "Glad I could help." Maddie walked to the door but hesitated before opening it. She looked back at him, something unreadable in her expression. Then, with the smallest smirk, she said, "Try putting up a picture or something, Luke. Might make this place feel less like a prison cell." And then she was gone. Luke stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door. And for the first time, he wondered what Maddie's apartment looked like. After that, Maddie started showing up more. Not often, not enough to call it a habit, but enough that Luke noticed. She'd knock on his door randomly, sometimes for a reason, sometimes just to annoy him. "I burned my dinner," she said one night, standing in his doorway. "You owe me food." "I don't owe you anything," Luke said, leaning against the doorframe. "You slept on my couch, that's worth at least one meal," he smirked. "Fine." "But you're cooking." Maddie sighed dramatically but pushed past him into the kitchen. Another night, she showed up unannounced, holding a deck of cards. "Poker," she said simply. "Let's go." Luke raised an eyebrow. "What do I get if I win?" She smirked. "Bragging rights," he chuckled. "And if you win?" She sat down at his table, shuffling the cards. "I get to pick your next haircut," Luke laughed. "Not happening," she grinned. Scared. And just like that, she became a part of his nights. Luke didn't question it. Didn't ask why she was suddenly knocking on his door, why she seemed to linger in his apartment a little longer each time. But one night, as she sat on his couch, laughing at something ridiculous he said, he realized something. He liked this. He liked her. Not just the banter, not just the challenge she presented. He liked Maddie. The way she rolled her eyes when she was amused, the way she tapped her fingers against her knee when she was thinking. The way she made his apartment feel less empty just by being there. And that scared him more than he cared to admit. Luke wasn't sure when it happened. When the sarcastic banter turned into something else. When her presence stopped being a casual intrusion and started feeling like the best part of his day. When the space between them felt charged, like an unspoken truth was hovering just beneath the surface. All he knew was that it was getting harder to ignore, especially now. Maddie was in his apartment again, curled up on his couch, one leg tucked beneath her, scrolling through something on her phone. She had stopped knocking a while ago, just waltzing in like she belonged there. And the worst part, she did. Luke leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her. "You're staring," she muttered without looking up. He smirked. "You always say that, because you always do it." He didn't deny it. Instead, he pushed off the counter, walking over to sit on the other end of the couch. His knee brushed against hers and she didn't move away. A dangerous habit. "So," she said, finally putting her phone down. "You're coming to the building party, right?" Luke raised a brow. "What building party?" she scoffed. "The one they've been advertising for weeks." "The one literally everyone's going to. Sounds like my nightmare." Maddie rolled her eyes. "It's not optional, I need a buffer," he smirked. "Oh, so you need me now," she scoffed. "Please." "I just don't want to deal with creepy Steve from 3B asking me out again." Luke's jaw tensed before he could stop it. "He asked you out." "Twice," she said, making a face. "He doesn't take hints." Luke exhaled slowly. He didn't like that at all. "Fine," he said. "I'll go." Maddie blinked like she wasn't expecting him to agree so quickly. Then she smirked. "Aw, Luke, are you protecting me?" He rolled his eyes. "Don't make it weird." She grinned. Too late. The night of the party, Luke was regretting everything. He wasn't the social type. He hated forced small talk, hated pretending to be interested in conversations about HOA fees and neighborly gossip. But then he saw Maddie. And suddenly, he didn't care about the party anymore. She was wearing a simple black dress, nothing fancy, but it hugged her in a way that made his brain short-circuit for a second. Her hair was down, waves cascading over her shoulders, and when she spotted him, she smirked like she knew exactly what she was doing to him. Luke swallowed hard. "You clean up nice," she said, eyeing him. He exhaled a laugh. "You're one to talk." She nudged him with her elbow and the touch sent a current through him. He was in trouble. They navigated the party together, Maddie leading the way, effortlessly dodging awkward conversations. Luke wasn't sure if it was intentional or not, but she stayed close, her shoulder brushing his, her fingers grazing his wrist when she reached for a drink. Then Steve from 3B showed up. "Maddie," Steve said, grinning, "glad you made it." She stiffened slightly, her grip tightening around her drink. "Hey, Steve." Luke's jaw clenched. Steve's gaze flicked to Luke, assessing. "And you are." Luke wrapped an arm casually around Maddie's waist, pulling her just slightly closer. "Luke," he said smoothly. "Her date." Maddie froze for half a second, then recovered, leaning into him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Steve's grin faltered. "Oh. I didn't realize." "You do now," Luke said, his voice just a little too even. Steve looked between them, then gave a tight nod. "Right. Well, enjoy the party." He walked away and Maddie exhaled, turning to Luke with a raised brow. "Her date," Luke shrugged. "Seemed easier." She studied him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. Then she smirked. "Jealous," he scoffed, "of Steve." "Please?" Maddie tilted her head, eyes locked onto his. "Then why are you still holding me?" Luke realized, too late, that his hand was still on her waist. He should have let go. He didn't. Instead, he tightened his grip slightly, his fingers pressing into the fabric of her dress. Maddie's breath hitched just barely, but he caught it. The air between them shifted. For months, they had danced around something neither of them was willing to name. But now, standing this close, her body flush against his, there was no more denying it. Luke wanted her. And from the way she was looking at him, lips slightly parted, eyes dark with something dangerous, she wanted him too. "Luke," she murmured. His name on her lips sent a shiver down his spine. He leaned in just enough to feel her breath against his skin. "Tell me to stop," he said, voice low. Maddie didn't move, didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her chin up, just slightly, inviting. But then someone bumped into them, breaking the moment. Maddie blinked, stepping back, and just like that, the spell was broken. Luke exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Maddie looked away, biting her lip. "We should—" "Yeah," he said quickly. "Yeah." They didn't talk about it. But later that night, when Luke walked her to her door, she hesitated. For a second, he thought she might say something. Acknowledge whatever had just happened between them. But then she smirked, masking whatever was underneath. "Good night, neighbor." And with that, she disappeared inside. Luke stood there for a long moment, staring at her door. This was getting dangerous. Because if she ever let him in, he wasn't sure he'd be able to leave. Luke couldn't stop replaying that moment in his head. The way Maddie had looked at him. The way her breath had hitched when he pulled her close. The way neither of them had wanted to move, and then just like that it was gone. For days after the party, things were different. Not in an obvious way. They still exchanged sarcastic remarks, she still waltzed into his apartment without knocking, and he still acted like she wasn't the only thing occupying his thoughts. But there was something beneath it now. A tension that hadn't been there before, a weight behind their glances, a hesitation in their movements, and Luke was losing his mind. The worst part. Maddie was acting like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't been seconds away from kissing him, like she hadn't melted into his touch. It was driving him insane. So one night, when she showed up at his door like she always did, he decided he was done pretending. She flopped onto his couch, stealing the remote. "Anything good on?" Luke leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "We need to talk." Maddie didn't look up. "Oh no." "That sounds serious." "I'm serious, Maddie." Something in his tone must have caught her off guard because she finally glanced at him. "Okay," she said slowly. "Talk," he exhaled, pushing off the counter. "Are we gonna ignore what happened the other night?" Maddie stiffened, but only for a second. "Nothing happened," Luke scoffed. "You really gonna lie to me like that?" She set the remote down, eyes meeting his. "What do you want me to say, Luke?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I don't know, maybe that you felt it too." Silence. Maddie looked away. "It was just a moment, it doesn't have to mean anything." Luke clenched his jaw. "But it does." Her fingers tapped anxiously against her knee, the only sign that she wasn't as unaffected as she pretended to be. "Maddie," he said, voice lower now. "Look at me." She did. Slowly, Luke stepped closer, closing the space between them. "Tell me you don't want this," he said quietly. "Tell me and I'll drop it." She swallowed hard. "Luke, say it." A long pause stretched between them. Maddie opened her mouth, but no words came out, because she couldn't. Luke saw it in her eyes, the same war he was fighting himself. The same pull, the same desire, the same fear, and then finally she exhaled. "This is a bad idea," Luke smirked. "You say that like it matters." Maddie huffed a laugh, shaking her head. "You're impossible." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And yet, here you are." She didn't move away, didn't push him back. Didn't do anything to stop what was about to happen. So Luke did what he had wanted to do since the moment she opened her door that first night. He kissed her, and Maddie kissed him back. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't careful. It was everything they had been holding back, months of tension, of stolen glances, of pretending they weren't drawn to each other like gravity. Her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, and Luke wasn't sure if he was breathing, wasn't sure if he even cared. All that mattered was this: her, Maddie. The woman who had driven him crazy from the second she moved in. The woman who had somehow, without him realizing it, become the best part of his day. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling in the space between them. Maddie let out a shaky laugh. "Took you long enough," Luke grinned. "I wanted to make sure you were worth the wait." She rolled her eyes, but her smile betrayed her. "You are such an ass." He kissed her again, just to shut her up. And this time, there was no hesitation. Maddie had always imagined that if she ever crossed the line with Luke, if she ever gave in to the pull between them, it would be a mistake. A fleeting lapse in judgment, something she could brush off with a joke and pretend never happened. But this was something else entirely. Because the second Luke kissed her, everything changed. There was no denying it anymore, no pretending, no running. Luke wasn't just a distraction, wasn't just the annoying neighbor she had spent months pretending to dislike. He was something more, something terrifying. Something she had been avoiding for all the wrong reasons. And now, standing in his apartment, his hands framing her face like she was something precious, Something worth holding on to. She realized she didn't want to avoid it anymore. She wanted him. Luke pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes dark and intense, searching hers for something, permission, maybe, or reassurance. As if he was waiting for her to take it all back. She didn't. Instead, she tugged him down again, crashing her lips to his with a desperation that had been building for far too long. He groaned against her mouth, his grip tightening, his fingers threading through her hair. It was overwhelming, the way he kissed, the way he touched her, the way he made her feel like the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid, and she didn't care. She wanted to drown in him. But then he pulled away, just slightly, resting his forehead against hers. His breathing was uneven, his hands still holding her like he wasn't ready to let go. "Maddie," he murmured, her name rough in his throat. She swallowed hard, her hands fisting in his shirt. "Yeah." His thumb traced along her cheekbones, slow and deliberate. "Tell me this isn't just a moment," she froze, because that was the thing, wasn't it? This wasn't just a moment. This wasn't something she could brush off. Luke wasn't someone she could walk away from. She exhaled shakily, closing her eyes for a brief second before opening them again. "It's not," she admitted quietly. "It never was." Something in his expression shifted, something deep and unreadable, but before she could analyze it, he kissed her again, this time slower, softer. Like he was memorizing her, like he was breathing her in. And Maddie let him, because for once she wasn't afraid, not of him, not of this, not of what it meant. The next morning, she woke up tangled in him. Luke was warm, solid, his arm draped lazily over her waist, his face buried in her hair. For a moment, she just lay there, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, feeling the rise and fall of his chest against her back. It was intimate, too intimate. And yet she didn't move, because somehow this felt right, like she belonged here, like she had always belonged here. As if sensing her thoughts, Luke stirred, his grip tightening slightly before his lips brushed against her shoulder. "You're thinking too much," he murmured sleepily. Maddie smirked, turning her head just enough to meet his gaze. "You're assuming I think at all," he chuckled, his voice still rough with sleep. "Fair point." She studied him for a long moment, taking in the mess of his hair, the way his eyes were softer in the morning light. He looked happy, and that scared her more than anything. Because if Luke was happy, if she was happy, then this wasn't just some impulsive decision. This was real. Luke must have sensed her hesitation because he shifted, propping himself up on one elbow and looking at her seriously. "You're thinking again," she sighed, rolling onto her back. I don't want to mess this up." His brows furrowed. "Maddie, I'm serious, Luke." She turned to him, her voice softer now. "I've never been good at this, at relationships. At letting people in." Luke was quiet for a moment, then he reached out, brushing his fingers along her jaw. "Then we take it slow." She swallowed hard. "And if I screw it up," he smirked, "then I'll annoy you until you fix it." Maddie let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "You really are impossible. And yet here you are." She rolled her eyes, but there was no real annoyance behind it, because he was right. Here she was, with him. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly where she was supposed to be. Weeks passed, and somehow, without either of them really acknowledging it, Luke and Maddie became a thing. Not just neighbors, not just friends, something more. She still rolled her eyes at him daily. He still found new ways to get under her skin. They still argued over ridiculous things like parking spots and whose turn it was to pick the movie. But now those arguments ended with kisses, with laughter, with whispered confessions in the middle of the night. And Luke had never been happier. Because Maddie Carter, the woman who had once slammed doors in his face and stolen his Wi-Fi and made his life infinitely more frustrating, was now the best damn thing that had ever happened to him. One night as they sat on his couch, Maddie curled up against his side, Luke found himself staring at her, overwhelmed by how much she had come to mean to him. She glanced up, catching his gaze. "What?" He hesitated, then smirked. "I was just thinking," she groaned. "Again, that's dangerous." He chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. I was thinking that I like this. She raised a brow. Like what? This, he said simply. You, us. Maddie was quiet for a moment, then she shifted, turning toward him fully. Yeah, she murmured, her fingers trailing down his arm. Me too. Luke's chest tightened, because this wasn't just a moment, this wasn't just a fling, this was everything. And as Maddie leaned in, kissing him softly, Luke knew. This was exactly where he was meant to be.